Welcome to our channel, where we talk all things true crime. This video is for educational purposes. Let's get started. May 18th, 2012, at 5:27 p.m., a 911 call comes into the West Bloomfield Police Department in Michigan. A distressed teen boy is on the phone pleading for help.
911, what's your emergency?
Well, I've just been shot.
What? Who?
I've just been shot.
Where are you at? Okay, how did you get shot? Who shot you?
My grandma shot me.
Your grandma and grandpa shot you?
My grandma. I'm gonna die. So.
Okay, stay on the phone with me, okay, sir? I'm gonna get help on the way. Okay? Where were you shot at? Where are you shot? Your chest?
Police are dispatched to the home. With police en route, the teen is still crying out for help. The dispatcher reassures him that the police are on their way and will arrive soon. Before the police can arrive, just 2 minutes later, more gunshots ring out.
I got shot again. Oh,
You got shot again? Are they still there?
I'm gonna die. My stomach is oh, yes. Please help. Oh.
Police arrive as shots are heard by dispatch. On scene, they hear even more. An officer sees someone move in front of the living room window. They're heading for the front door. The door opens and there stands a frail 74-year-old woman by the name of Sandra Layne. Sandra has already placed the gun on the floor at her feet. In a state of shock and confusion, Sandra matter-of-factly states, "I murdered my grandson." She repeated this statement multiple times as she was put into handcuffs and secured in the police car. Fred Layne, Sandra's husband, arrived on scene. He said he had only been gone for an hour and had no idea what could have happened. Officers immediately search the residence for the caller. A smoky haze fills the air from the recently discharged weapon. Blood trails scatter the three-story residence in an unorganized maze. Bloody footprints lead down to the basement, but no one is there. There are holes in the sheetrock, and 10 bullet casings are strewed around the home. The police would find the teen upstairs in the loft, lying on the floor. He had multiple gunshot wounds to the upper torso, but he had a faint pulse. They realized that the young man lying there in just basketball shorts and socks was the 17-year-old grandson of Sandra, Jonathan Hoffman. He was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, Jonathan would not make it and was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital at 6:02 p.m. A gun case and ammunition were found on 2 different floors. Everything was photographed at the crime scene, including Sandra. Pictures were taken of her hands, face, arms, and clothing, along with everything in the home. The police questioned Sandra about what happened. She was so hysterical that she could not respond to any questions. She was also taken to the hospital. As Sandra begins calming down, she is able to tell the police that Jonathan did not hurt her. Sandra states that he was a good boy. Around midnight, Sandra was medically cleared and transported to jail to be booked in. Once arriving at the jail, Sandra spoke with her attorney. With the attorney present, she tells a different story. Sandra says that Jonathan attacked her. There was a struggle, yelling, and she was kicked in the stomach. She got out a gun to defend herself, stating that she was in fear of her life. She also stated that Jonathan demanded money and said he was taking her car and she couldn't stop him. Police reviewed the photos of Sandra from the crime scene, but there were no signs that she had been in a struggle. Without any other witnesses, what really happened? Who was the main aggressor? 2 days after this tragic incident, Sandra was arraigned at the district court. The judge did not believe the story of self-defense. Sandra was held without a bond at the Huron Valley Correctional Facility while waiting for a preliminary hearing. The prosecutors took this time to evaluate the evidence to build the state's case, which was that Sandra committed cold-blooded murder. The first thing they did was look at her character. She was a typical grandmother. She was affluent, taught at school, volunteered, and was active in her synagogue, and had a close relationship with her grandson. Sandra was a pillar of the community that did not fit the profile. The prosecutors decided to look at the victim, Jonathan Hoffman, to try to make sense of what happened. It was later learned that Jonathan had a police record. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Jonathan had moved in with his grandmother Sandra and his step-grandfather Fred to finish out his senior year in high school. Jonathan's parents had divorced in 2008. In 2011, his dad wanted to move to Arizona. Jennifer, Jonathan's mom, went along with the kids so that they would each still be able to see the kids. Shortly after the move, Jessica, Jonathan's younger sister, became very ill. Jessica had a brain tumor and would need surgery immediately. Jennifer stayed at the hospital with Jessica for a month while Jessica was being treated. Jonathan possibly felt abandoned and wanted to move back home where his school and friends were, back to where everything was familiar.
Sandra offered to let Jonathan come and stay with her and Fred to finish out high school. Jonathan, who was born in 1994, had spent a lot of time with his grandmother growing up. Jennifer asked her mom if she would be able to handle a teen living in the house. Sandra reassured her that she could by stating, "Oh, he's a good boy. I can handle it. He's a good boy." Although Jennifer was hesitant, she agreed. Once Jessica was home from the hospital and stable, Jennifer traveled back to Michigan to see Jonathan for 2 weeks. Jennifer stated that Jonathan seemed happy, but she found out her son was using Spice. At the time, Spice was a popular synthetic marijuana known as K2. The product could be purchased over the counter at nearly every gas station without providing any ID. Jennifer just thought that Jonathan was getting older and that since it wasn't real and it could be purchased by anyone, she didn't make a big deal about it. Sandra was also aware of Jonathan's usage of this product.
Friends would describe Jonathan as weird but cool. He could make people laugh, was a good listener, and shy at times, but was friends with everyone. One night, Jonathan had been pulled over by the police, and weed was found in his car. He was put on probation for this incident, but would be pulled over again by police, and he was caught with a prescription pill that didn't belong to him. He had a probation officer assigned to him. Sandra would say that Jonathan became an angry kid. She didn't like the friends he was hanging out with, and he would bring the friends over at all hours of the night. Someone was always coming and going. Some of Sandra's belongings were stolen. Maybe Jonathan was just rebelling because of his age, or maybe because he felt abandoned by his parents. But it was clear to Sandra that something had changed with her grandson.
The day of the 911 call was not the first time police were called to the residence. A few weeks prior, Sandra had called. When police arrived on scene, Jonathan was outside and out of control. He was calling his mom foul names and was yelling at his grandmother, as well as the police. It was reported that the only reason Jonathan didn't go to jail was because Sandra begged them not to take him in. Sandra claimed it was at this point she purchased a gun for her safety.
1 month after his death, Jonathan's autopsy was released. The cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds. The wounds indicated that he was shot at varying distances, some from afar and some up close. He did in fact have K2 in his system. The manner of death was listed as a homicide. 2 months after Sandra's arrest, she was charged with the possession of a firearm in the commission of a felony and open murder. This is not something we've heard before, but apparently only 2 states recognize it as a charge, Michigan and Nevada. Basically, the open murder charge includes all possible murder charges like first degree, second degree, manslaughter, etc., and it is up to the jury to decide which one was committed.
The community's reaction to this incident was not what you would typically see when someone loses their life. The community supported Sandra and accepted her story of self-defense. Almost everyone blamed the parents. Comments were publicly made like, "He deserved it," "Get these drug-using kids out of our community," and "Go, Granny, go." The public saw Sandra as a vulnerable elderly woman protecting herself from a substance-using monster. Jonathan was known to use K2 along with other high school students.
At this point, K2 was associated with violence, and it didn't help that there had been another horrific crime committed in the surrounding area the month before this. 19-year-old Tucker Cipriano and his accomplice, Mitchell Young, brutally took a baseball bat to Tucker's adopted family that resulted in the death of his father and permanently injuring his mother and brother. It was reported that both young men were juiced up on K2 at the time of their crimes. This case became national news, and Jonathan's mom began receiving hate messages on Facebook. Random strangers would send her things like, "He was thinking he was a gangster," "You deserve to die because you were a terrible mother," among other rage-filled statements. Everyone in the family sided with Sandra except for Jonathan's parents. Jonathan's parents felt villainized and alone. Jennifer never thought this would happen. She was trying to do the best thing for both of her children at the time. Being in the hospital with Jessica didn't allow her to be with Jonathan, and he was so miserable in Nevada, she let him go stay with her mom. Jennifer's kids loved their grandmother, and this stay would only be for the rest of Jonathan's senior year, which was almost over.
Jennifer recalls her childhood with her mom, Sandra. The family lived outside the Detroit area and was extremely dysfunctional. Her parents argued all the time. Sandra was reported to be controlling and have bouts of rage towards the family. Jennifer's dad was never around because he traveled for work. One day, her dad left and never came back. A few years later, Sandra married Fred and their lives changed. Her mother was different. Sandra was happy and Fred was so nice. There was no more arguing, and Fred was the dad that Jennifer needed. Once Jennifer had her firstborn child, Jonathan, Sandra's controlling behavior returned and was obsessive at times. There would be disagreements between Jennifer and Sandra, but Jennifer just saw it as Sandra's need to be in her grandchildren's lives. Sandra was an amazing grandmother.
After spending 1 year in jail, Sandra's trial would begin. She appeared in court looking frail. Sandra wore no makeup and had stopped dyeing her hair. It was now gray. She rocked in her chair, appearing distraught. Her husband of 30 years would be called to testify. He stated that he didn't know of any issues with Jonathan because if he did, he would have made him move back with his parents. Maybe Sandra knew this, so she kept the problems to herself. Fred was asked if he knew his wife had purchased a gun. He said no. Fred was asked if he knew that his wife went target practicing. He said no. Apparently, Sandra had purchased the gun with cash, then went to a range for target practice in the weeks leading up to the incident, all while keeping it a secret from her longtime husband. Fred went on to say that Sandra told him to leave the house right before Jonathan lost his life. We don't really know where Fred went, but he was close enough that he heard the sirens and immediately thought, "Oh no, is that for John?" and headed home. That's why Fred arrived on the scene shortly after the police. Fred stated that he was flabbergasted.
The prosecution showed pictures of Sandra right after the shooting. Her hair and glasses were still in place. There was no rips or tears on her clothing. Although she had a small amount of blood on her hands, she had no injuries. Sandra was even wearing bracelets that were still in place. The prosecutor argued if there had been a struggle, her bracelets would have caused a mark or injury on her wrist and hands, or even have been ripped off. It was revealed that there was blood on the magazine. This indicated that Sandra would run out of ammunition and reload to continue her attack. Remember the bloody footprints to the basement? Well, they were Sandra's. She had gone down to the basement where the ammunition was to reload.
Sandra would say that there was still a struggle after the first shots, and that's why she reloaded. The defense played a part of the 911 call, and Sandra can be heard yelling, which sounds like a struggle. The call goes on to capture Sandra telling Jonathan to lay down. He needed some water. The defense argued that this showed that Sandra cared for her grandson and did not intend to hurt him, and she was only protecting herself. Sandra testified about Jonathan's behavior in the months prior. She said that any time there was a disagreement, Jonathan would become aggressive and start kicking things. He allegedly kicked holes in the closet doors and kicked a monitor. She let him know that she didn't like his friends and didn't want them over, but Jonathan continued to bring strangers into her home, and then some of her items went missing. Sandra knew that her grandson and his friends were using K2. She was afraid that she would get hurt, and that is why she purchased the gun.
The day of the shooting, Sandra took Jonathan to see his probation officer. Sandra had told his PO about his K2 usage. The probation officer was thinking about violating him. They both returned home after the visit to the probation office, and Jonathan was very upset because he knew if he got a violation from his PO that he would likely go to jail. So that's when he demanded the money from his grandmother and said he was taking her car. It sounds like Jonathan thought he could run away from his problems. Sandra stated that he was growing more and more aggressive, and that's when she decided to get the gun.
The prosecution would cross-examine Sandra, and her tearful, helpless demeanor changed to being defensive. The prosecution would bring up the fact that while Jonathan was on the phone with 911 begging for help, that there were 2 minutes and 51 seconds that went by that Sandra could have used to get out of the house or call 911, but she didn't. Instead, she opened fire on him again. Jonathan could barely speak and was no longer a threat, but she would shoot again anyways. Michigan is a stand-your-ground state, so she wouldn't have been required to leave her home during the attack. But if Sandra was so scared of her grandson, why would she want to be left alone with him?
The toxicology from Jonathan's autopsy would be presented as evidence. It's no surprise that K2 showed up. However, it was only in his urine. This was extremely important because that means that his body had already metabolized it, and he was not actively being influenced by the substance at the time of the incident as everyone had initially thought. During cross-examination, Sandra would make a statement that left the entire courtroom in absolute silence. She said she had grabbed the gun because she wanted to make him listen, not because she was afraid for her life, but because he just wouldn't listen to her.
After a 10-day trial, the jury would deliberate for 2 days. The verdict came back as guilty for second-degree murder. At sentencing, Sandra was crying and pleading with the judge that she did not want to die in prison. Sandra's daughter Jennifer would give a statement. She addressed her mother by her name and not as Mom. In fact, Jennifer no longer addresses her mom at all. Jennifer went on to ask the court to show no mercy to Sandra, but instead asked for the maximum sentence possible because Jonathan's life was just beginning. Sandra had robbed him and his family of any future milestones, like graduating, getting married, or becoming a father, all because Sandra couldn't control him.
As the judge handed down Sandra's sentence, she stated that she did not believe that Sandra acted in self-defense. Sandra did not call the police for help, and she made her husband leave the home. That shows some kind of intent. With Fred gone, no one would be able to stop her. Sandra also had multiple opportunities to reconsider what she was doing, especially during the almost 3 minutes she took to reload her weapon. Sandra was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison.
As Sandra left the courtroom, there was something sinister about the scowl upon her face. Have you all heard of this case? What do you think? Who did you think the main aggressor was going to be? Let us know in the comments below.